Well, hello, everybody. This is Tim Green with Rattle Magazine, and this is your Rattlecast for Tuesday, February 11th. We have a great show for you today. We have one of last year's Rattle Chapbook Prize winners, Christina Olson, on the line. She's going to be talking about The Last Mastodon and her other books. I've been looking forward to this interview for a long time because Christina has sort of a science background and interest, and so do I. So she's a poet that I'm very interested in talking to about a lot of things. So looking forward to that. As always, we like to do a little bit of a warm-up poem as people trickle in so we get the full audience for Christina. And I hit the random button again, and this time what came up was a poem by Federer Sheridan. I know a couple of weeks ago we did a poem by Patricia Smith, another slam poet, and this is Federer Sheridan. Let me read her bio really quick. Thadra Sheridan is a poet, essayist, columnist, teacher, and performer from Minneapolis, Minnesota. Her work has been featured on the final episode of HBO's Deaf Poetry Jam, Minnesota Public Radio, Upworthy, Button Poetry, and venues across the country, including San Quentin Prison, where she scored serious points talking about her terrible taste in men. And that's her bio from her website, which is thadrasheridan.com. That's THADRA Sheridan.com. Check her out there. But here she is. This is a poem from issue number 27. This is After the Bowling Stopped.
Last night, this guy played guitar on stage, and it made me think of you because you play guitar on stage. So I spent the next 15 minutes running a mental slideshow. Los Angeles, you give me half of your egg salad sandwich. Indianapolis, you grab me because the smell of gasoline on my fingers turns you on. Chicago, we play Ferris Bueller and follow a kids' tour group at the Institute of Arts, Ashland. You bowl 5 strikes in a row, etc., etc. I find this still happens a lot. Someone's wearing shoes, so I think of you because you wear shoes. You drink beverages. You breathe air. You can see how this might be a problem. Sometimes I just blurt your name out loud in my apartment for no reason, like a Tourette's outburst, and I'm supposed to write this poem about you. Because I keep saying I'm a poet, and I've been trying for the 3 years since you stopped bowling in my presence, but it keeps coming out like, I hate you, I wish I'd never agreed to date you. Or the day you left. The sun set for the last time, the trees wilted and happy little creatures ceased to scurry. Or my heart is a block of frozen, petrified, solid, really hard ice without you. Or I don't need you, never did. I can open my own pickle jaws, motherfucker. Oh, I can write volumes about every little one-night stand, pointless encounter, waste of saliva I've tried to replace you, but you're drying up the ink in all my favorite pens. You're hiding all my journals and shorting out my keyboard. You are the quintessential cock block. If I had a cock, you are the ultimate writer's block. No, wait, that one works. The point is, I know you can eat a whole egg salad sandwich, but I appreciate the gesture. And that stretch of 90-94 from Chicago to Rockford has never been the same since I drove it home from the end of time. And when you stayed over this past spring, you slept on the couch, took a shower, and left. But it took me 3 days to take your towel out of the bathroom, and 5 more to wash it. I find I can't really write about something till I have a little distance perspective, and you're still mashed up against me like a Siamese twin. And the kicker is, I can't even say I want you back. You were all shades of fiasco. I was only on your mind if I was waving my arms in front of you and having sex with you. Well, I suspect you wouldn't have known the difference if I had been inflatable. And you only gave me the sandwich because you were being such an asshole. So if you asked, would I take you back? Yeah, I totally would. And that pisses me off. But if I was with you right now, I'd be sitting in some hotel room in New York getting my ass kicked at Scrabble, or pitching a makeshift baseball game in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and my debt would be twice as ridiculous and I'd weigh 100 pounds because you supplement eating and sleeping and not in any good way. But I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't be running my stupid life. You are the rock star me I am too impatient to wait for, and you've got nothing to do with anything. Most of my friends don't even know what you look like, so you're all mine. And a terrible kisser. and a really sore loser. And I suspect you'll litter my life with unfinished pages about the empty spaces you left in my apartment for years to come. And tonight, when someone asks to borrow a guitar pick, or uses the words and or the, I'll think of you. Snapshot something somewhere away from here and today. Not much I can really do about that, just thought I'd mention it because it was on my mind.
And that was Federer Sheridan with her poem After the Bowling Stop. That pickle jar line cracks me up every time. I can't help it. Sorry. Okay, so today's featured poet, as I mentioned before, she's winner of the 2019 Rattle Chapbook Prize, one of three, and I just love this book. It's a topic I've always found so fascinating. Her book is The Last Mastodon. She's also the author of other poetry collections, Terminal Human Velocity, and Before I Came Home Naked, as well as the chapbooks Weird Science and Rook and The Me, a Law and Order inspired narrative. Her poetry and nonfiction appeared all over the place. She's a recipient of fellowships from the Vermont Studio Arts Center and Willapa Bay Air. She teaches creative writing at Georgia Southern University and tweets as Olson Quest. You can find her online at the Drevlov-olsonshow.com. That's the DREVLOW Olson, OLSON show.com. And here she is, Christina Olson. Hi, Christina. How you doing?
I'm good. Yeah.
Oh, say it again. How are you doing? I had you on mute.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, and I was going to say, now you know why I did not ever take my husband's last name, because it is Osterith.
That's your husband? Is Drevlow your husband?
Yeah, Drevlow. Yeah, Benjamin Drevlow. So, yeah.
What is the Drevlow Olson show? Is your life is he a writer too? I keep seeing that. Yeah.
Yeah, he's a fiction writer. He writes some nonfiction as well. And I know that it's, usually if you're part of like a literary couple, you each have your own website, but we are poor, so we we shared hosting. But we kind of also feel like if you like what one of us writes, you'll probably like what the other one writes, right? Yeah. I mean, so yeah, fairly similar in that way.
Well, that sounds good. It's kind of like the synergy there. You can tap into each other's audiences.
Yeah, drive that traffic, baby. Drive that traffic.
So do you want to start out with reading a poem from the book maybe, or whatever you want?
Yeah.
And say the page number so I can get to it really quick too.
Okay, so I'm going to read a bunch of stuff from The Last Mastodon, and this is the very first poem. It starts on page 9. And I won't talk a lot because I know we're going to talk, but I will say just kind of by way of grounding everyone. So this book is written after I spent time at the Western Science Center, which is in Hemet, California. So, what is that, like an hour and a half inland from LA? Somewhere thereabouts.
Yeah, about an hour and a half, yeah.
Yeah, big mountains, dry. And so I have a friend who's a paleontologist, and she studies mastodons. And over the years, as we were talking, she kind of, kidding, not kidding, said, "Oh, we should really work together. You should write a series of poems about mastodons." And I was like, "Oh yeah, sure." And then one day she came to me and she was like, "No, for real though, like we're doing the conference, so I put you down as the poet in residence." And I was like, "All right, I have no idea what that means." And I knew just enough about mastodons. Like I knew that they weren't mammoths, right? And so one of the very first things I learned is, aside from size, the way that you tell them apart is the teeth. And so this poem is about that. And it's also about where the word mastodon actually comes from. So this poem is called Catalogue of Damages. And it's the title poem, it's the first poem in the book. And I think it covers a lot of what the book does. Catalogue of Damages. All these years not knowing the difference between mammoth and mastodon. Just another human so proud in her indifference. It's in the teeth. Mammoth teeth resemble the rubber sole of a snow boot. Mastodon teeth, jagged mountains, turn to granite after all these years. Jefferson thought the West still crawled with mastodons, sent Lewis and Clark to thin the herd. All morning, I've tried to reconcile our ambition with the misery it brings, what we set out to do, and what disaster ensues. 11 feet high at the shoulder, Max is the largest mastodon in the West. Jefferson owned Sally Hemings. I never could make small talk with my father. I told you this was a catalogue of damages. Oh God, the mouth is such a weapon.
Once again, that was Catalogue of Damages from Christina Olson's chapbook, which every subscriber of Rattle has, The Last Mastodon. Christina, let me ask about the research that went into this book, because I know you just explained how you had that internship or fellowship or whatever it was called at the Western Science Center. But how did you know? I never knew that Jefferson was interested in mastodons. Where did you pick that up?
That's a great question. I'd like to say something better than Wikipedia. Definitely confirmed by Wikipedia. I have this notebook that was just a lot of kind of the flotsam and the jetsam of the things I heard. So I was with these paleontologists for 3 days, and they were super jazzed to be together because this is a mild exaggeration, but there's only like 20 of them that study mastodons. And you kind of get the impression talking to them that like mammoths are those sexy ones, right? And that it's not like all that common for them to just have like this mastodon focus conference. So they were really excited. And so a lot of things kind of came up. But yeah, Jefferson definitely came up in as much as, he really, really wanted to prove to Europe that the U.S. was like bigger and stronger and younger. And so he just kind of like broadly announced that there were mastodons out west and Lewis and Clark were definitely going to bring them back alive, which is like a bold statement. Totally inaccurate, as it turns out. But he was a complicated man, which is what the poem was also about. But he also... he got mad once and just sent a moose to Europe to prove to them that the U.S. was better. So like from an animal rights perspective, that's super problematic. But I love the idea of just being like, you know what? Send him a moose and that will like settle it, And also he wasn't even thinking because the Irish elk used to live over in in Europe and was much larger than a moose. But, anyway.
So how did you tie so many things? I feel like, I don't know if it's a phrase that I sort of used myself, but it's a book about sort of human sense of ownership too at the same time. Yeah. And so Jefferson's, as a slave owner, and the sense of like the United States owning everything within our boundaries and eventually owning the world is such an important part of the subject. How did you like figure out how everything tied together? Like, what was that process like?
So I have to shout out to the lyric essay here because if you had asked me 10 years ago, this would have been a really different book. But then in more recent years, I got really into, that subgenre of creative nonfiction that's about the lyric essay and just tying together things. And not just tying them together, but I think being really comfortable as a writer, not having all the answers, right? Like working in juxtaposition and putting together these things and having inference rather than thesis be the thing that's guiding a piece of writing. And so that's a fancy answer. I mean, the short answer is that I just couldn't stop myself because when I started writing the book and I started looking at my notes, everything, like all the associations started coming in. And so Jefferson was an easy one because, on the one hand, you have this gentleman like naturalist who did a lot of really amazing things as far as plantings, right, and horticulture, but then also owned people. And whenever we talk about Jefferson, we say like, oh, he planted 60 species of fig trees, but like Jefferson didn't plant the trees, man. Like the people he owned did. And so you can't talk about Jefferson without talking about that part and about that complexity and problem. The other part the other kind of, I think, third thread to the book is the relationship that I have with my dad. I'll tell you, it's biographical. I'm totally comfortable admitting that. My dad was a geologist. He's He's retired now, but I would not have ever been interested in fossils if it hadn't been for growing up in a house, with someone who was interested in geology and paleontology. And so we have this really complicated relationship right now, and we don't speak a lot, but I couldn't stand in a museum and not think of him. Mm-hmm. And so this poem was the first one I wrote. And I think at the time I was just kind of associating these three things, and then I kind of stepped back from the draft and I was like, oh no, never mind, like this is what they all have in common, right? Like the mastodon at the Western Science Center, his name is Max because he's big. He's dead because another male punched him with a tusk and he died, right? And so I just started thinking about the mouth and all the ugliness and the beauty that mouths contain.
Mm-hmm. It's just so interesting to me because what makes me interested in poetry, as somebody who sort of looks at it from a science perspective too, actually, is the way that we make these leaps of sort of associative, like there's a way that the poetic brain sees the world holistically in a way that science doesn't. And so it's like a key to scientific understanding in a really interesting way, which is what always got me interested in poetry. And like comparing mastodons and their extinction to slavery and to relationships with fathers. It's something that like you would never think to do. And
I have to give a shout out to you because like this was a manuscript that I finished and I was like, I love this book, right? I have no idea what's going to happen to this book in the world. Like this is a book that a press is either going to love or they're just going to be like, what? You know what I mean? Like there isn't going to be a lot of in between on this one. And but I remember the first conversation that you and I had and you were like, this book is, you didn't say it quite this way, but you were like, this book is amazing and kind of bonkers.
Well, it definitely is. Yeah. I loved it. It was one of those ones I read it and I was like, yeah, that's one of the winners. And then I just put it aside and,
I figured amazing. I didn't mean like pay you a compliment. But it was more like we were not expecting this manuscript, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, but that's what I'm always looking for is something that I have no idea to expect or what I'm looking for. So it was really cool to read.
Yeah, but that's the best picking up a book, right? Where you're like, I don't know what journey I'm so glad I did, right?
Yeah. That's exactly why I just should say that's why I think the model of having chapbooks with the issues, that was my goal, because you subscribe, you have no idea what you're going to get. And I really think that that books should work on this model, these small press books. I really wish presses would have a subscription, and then you have no idea what you're going to get, and it's like a curated selection of books. I think that would be so fun to do. I think Tupelo does that a little bit, but I hope more people start to do that because it'd be a cool, because nobody expected a book like this, and then they got it, and the reviews, all our subscribers who wrote to me said they loved it, so it's really cool to see that it worked. Yeah.
Cool.
Let me say before we continue that if you have any questions for Christina, I'm watching the YouTube chat window. If you want to leave a question, I'll pass it along. But Christina, do you want to read 2 more poems, maybe?
Yeah. I will read a longer one. It's the third one. It's slightly longer. And then I'll follow it up with a little bit of a shorter one. So I'll jump to page 11 for those of you following along at home. I'm still not sure if it's a prose poem or a flash creative nonfiction essay, but it is about the things we were just talking about. It's called Who Gets to Be a Fossil? And I take the title from this display. I think that was meant for children at the Western Science Center, but I liked the phrase, who gets to be a fossil? So I stole it. Who gets to be a fossil? Max the Mastodon gets to be a fossil. Thomas Jefferson gets to be a fossil. Max lived 14,000 years ago in a scrub forest filled with lizards and quail. Thomas Jefferson built Monticello and signed the Declaration of Independence. Sometimes Max used his tusks to fight other mastodons, and sometimes his tusk would pierce the skull of the other male he was fighting, and that mastodon died. I Google, where is Thomas Jefferson buried? And the answer is on a website run by a woman named Carol, who posts pictures of the graves of Thomas Jefferson and his family. Carol writes, something of a disappointment was the fact that the locked wrought iron fence prohibited visitors from paying homage to the great man and his family. Max kept wandering through the California scrub until he died, and his bones turned hard, and then some men in hats found them when they were digging a dam. Carol's website also features a recipe for Carol's low-fat peanut soup and something called crockpot dinner of beans, kale, and sausage for 3. Jefferson fathered 6 children with his slave Sally Hemings. 4 lived to adulthood, which means Sally would need to make dinner of beans and kale times 1 1/3 to feed their children. The mastodons are dead, and you and I will never see them. Carol writes, somehow it felt as if we were being banned from his world. Sally Hemings may have lived in a room in Monticello's South Dependencies, a wing of the mansion accessible to the main house through a covered passageway. Carol writes, Thomas Jefferson belongs to his United States of America for time eternal. Sally Hemings belonged to Jefferson for time eternal, or until he died. Max the Mastodon belongs to the Western Science Center in Hemet, California, and people paid to look at him because he is a very impressive mastodon fossil, the biggest found west of the Mississippi River. Thomas Jefferson is buried in Monticello, behind a wrought iron fence that prevents unwanted visitors. Sally Hemings was buried in a site in downtown Charlottesville, Virginia, which is now covered by the parking lot of the Hampton Inn on West Main Street. And then I'll flip to the very next poem in the book is there's another mastodon at Western Science Center, and its name is Little Stevie. And so this is a poem for Little Stevie. It's called Wake Up, Little Stevie. In another dimension, the mastodons are still alive, their teeth not yet white marble, hard as a Venus's breast. And in another dimension, the ocean has not yet receded like a hairline, and the freeway does not yet hold California together like sutures. And the water in Diamond Valley Lake sparkles like nothing, because there is no water, there is no lake. And the mastodons are not hardening in their muddy graves. They are instead pissing and fighting and breathing, like you did this morning. And in another dimension, the great tusks are not slumbering in tar, waiting out of the black rot. And in another dimension, you are little Stevie, lumbering in the scrub. And you are not thinking about death, but rather dinner. And in another dimension, you are alive. You are alive, not dead. No, never dead.
And that was Wake Up, Little Stevie from The Last Mastodon. Now, Christina, this is the segment of the episode where I just want to geek out a little bit, because I've been obsessed with mastodons and their extinction since I was a kid. Okay. And I don't want. I know you have friends who are paleontologists, right? I don't want to offend anybody, but I've always felt like the overkill hypothesis was the most ridiculous hypothesis in science ever like recorded. I just to say, I mean, yeah, seriously. So I just to tell you the background, when I was in college or high school, I took the ACT test. I don't know if they still do that, but it's like a science-oriented version of the SAT. And one of the things was science comprehension. I knew nothing about mastodons at the time, but the little article we had to do for reading comprehension was about the overkill hypothesis. It was like some article from Nature, and we had to answer the questions. And I just remember sitting there thinking, that is the most absurd thing I've ever heard, that humans could, overhunt. I mean, just by the numbers, there were like a million humans in the world, and there were, and most of them were in, Africa and like the Fertile Crescent area, maybe like 50 to 100,000 North America if you're generous of the Clovis people, and there were like 300,000 mastodons and mammoths, and then all the other animals that went extinct too, the saber-toothed tigers, the ground sloths, which you talk about here, the camelops. The idea that they hunted out the mastodons just strikes me as like just insane. I don't buy it for a second.
Ultimate human hubris, right? It's like, oh, we did that. We're actually kind of a big deal.
Yeah. I know. I feel like it's a combination of like the naturalistic fallacy, like everything was great before humans screwed it up. Yeah. And then also there's the whole problem with gradualism as a response to like creationism, and how like original geologists and paleontologists were all like religious. And so everybody didn't want to be religious. So they sort of said nothing can happen suddenly. But it seems so clear that there was some kind of catastrophe back then. And this is a long rambling introduction. But so I went to the San Diego Zoo about 10 years ago, right? And there's a little section in the San Diego Zoo that says that at the time we went 10 years ago, it said the mastodons and saber-toothed tigers were wiped out by a comet. And I was like, whoa, so there you go. Like, they sort of changed their mind. I went back again 2 years later, and it was gone. So...
Wait, never mind.
Exactly. So
no
what...
exhibit anyway.
So what do the mastodon paleontologists say wiped out the... Because I haven't, followed it that closely, but I'd like to know, what do they say now?
Climate change?
Yeah.
Yeah, which we actually probably didn't cause back then, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I had mentioned earlier that my dad was he was a paleontologist / geologist. Like, he ended up working in geology, but, we had a house full of fossils. And so one of the things that I got from him is... when I was a little kid in the 80s, I got a series of books by Roy Chapman Andrews that had been my father's, and they're from the early 50s. And it's how I got into all this stuff. Like, there's this book called All About Strange Creatures of the Past, and it's awesome, and it shows, Stone Age people trapping woolly rhinoceroses in a pit and then throwing boulders on them. And, one of the great disappointments of life is you go to, a museum, and you're like, none of this is right. Like, that book was... That book is seriously overdue for an update. And actually, one of my favorite museums in the world for two reasons is I love the Page Museum at La Brea, because I love, obviously, that it's a tar pit. But I also love that it's, a little janky. And it's you just want to give them a bunch of money and be like, you need to fix some of these exhibits, right? So it was really fun when Katie and I were done out in Hamet. Yeah, we went to LA, and just everyone should go to a museum with someone who is a specialist in that museum. It's just, they were like, oh yeah, no, that's not quite right anymore. Or they're like, no, I wrote a paper about that, so that will be fixed one day. It's cool. It's really cool. Yeah. But
Yeah.
They just, I don't know, things changed and they ran out of stuff to eat.
Well, I think something huge happened back then, which is why it's an interesting topic, because there's the and I think there's the comet, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis. I think maybe there was some kind of big solar flare that, because a lot of the evidence would be very, very similar, but there's the black mat layer. And there's where I think there's 150 lakes that have a huge, thick black mac of burned char at the same age, 12,900 years ago. And I just think it's just amazing to imagine being one of the Clovis people back then and seeing something crazy, and then coming out of your cave where you were hiding from the lightning or the fire or whatever was happening. And then 12,000 years ago, being blamed for the poor mastodons.
Yeah.
who you hunted a little bit, but there's no way you hunted those to extinction.
No, and also all these things are just kind of dying around you, and you're like, what a mess this is. I don't know how to clean this up. Megafauna is mega for a reason. Those are big, messy corpses.
Yeah.
If you ever played Oregon Trail, I'm going somewhere with this, I promise. If you ever played Oregon Trail computer game and you went out and shot bison and it was you got 256 pounds of meat, but you could only carry 8 back to the wagon, and you're just like, oh, cool. I guess that's just going to rot in a field. So. Yeah, but that was, that was actually one of the things that I totally geeked out on is the paleontologists were there to do work, right? But they were super friendly, and they were it's like anyone who's into a subject. They just want you to be into the subject, right? And I would say things, but then also very carefully be like, you can correct me if that's not right. I'm getting this, from a Roy Chapman Andrews book from 1954 or whatever. But yeah, they were so kind and fun to talk to. They just wanted to sit around and talk about these things,
Yeah. I was just so jealous when I saw that you got to do that. And
shout out to the Western Science Center. The people there are legitimately the coolest. They are. They just opened their doors, and they were so friendly and so great, and they just want everyone to have this really amazing experience and love mastodons as much as they do. So yeah, if you get a chance, everyone should go.
Yeah, and another thing I think that would be really cool if we did more with poetry is embed poets into places like that. I just think that would be really cool if we could find a way to do that more. Do you have any sort of advice or ways of getting. I know I didn't know coming in that it was a friend of yours, so you had a connection already. But you've done a lot of books that are about about science. Well, you have one other book that's about a lot about science, and do you think about doing that otherwise? And what advice would you give for poets who, if they want to try to do something like that? Because it would be so cool. I mean, like you imagine fiction writers like riding along with cops to learn about like the murder beat and stuff like that. Yeah. And why can't poets do a lot more of that? I think it would be really cool if we did.
Yeah, we need to embed more often, right? I mean, what's interesting is that I think that and I'm speaking anecdotally here, I can't like name names, but you see so many residencies that are for, national parks, right? Or natural spaces, and they want, artists to come and make art about it or in it. And I love that, but this is a little bit, it's a total false binary, but in my head, I always think of that as nature and not like science. Mm-hmm. And to me, and I'm just saying this is the way I've come to navigate it, like science is the one where you can't subvert the fact for the sake of the poem, right? Mm-hmm. If I'm writing a poem about a bird that I saw when I was out on a walk, which I do because I like looking at birds, they're tiny dinosaurs. If I'm writing a poem that takes place in nature, it usually doesn't matter so much which bird, right? But if I'm writing about a mastodon, I can't just start making stuff up because, first of all, there's at least 13 people on the planet who are going to be like, that's not right. And also, I really like working in that confine, right? I think that's the really cool thing is like when you set out to do a project like that, first of all, it's like most people who do research are really excited to tell you about their research, right? I mean, it's like any of us with any sort of like passion project, like whatever, a writer is working on, if you get them at a cocktail party and it's like, oh, tell me about your manuscript. Like usually you're the one who has to like run away and hide in the coat closet, right? Like 2 hours have passed and you're like, okay, minimalism, got it. Or whatever, And so I love talking to scientists about what they're working on. And then I think they love my clumsy, terrible metaphors where I'm like, so is it like this? And they're like, no, not at all. So I'm sure they get like outreach or education out of it. They're like, let's fix that dum-dum. But it is, it's like I just did a class visit at college at Charleston where there's two female instructors and one's a scientist and one's a poet, and they're doing a class where like the students work with both. And I love that because it feels like such a false construct that we separate these things. Like here is literature and here's like STEM, right? And so I think the more that people can just go out and spend the day, in a science museum or fall down some rabbit hole on the internet or call the paleontologist. I mean, I think we're all better for it, right? I mean, like we're all better for understanding how the world works, and we're all better for talking to each other and pretending these things are, or not pretending that these things are so different.
Yeah, and there's a really interesting way that art helps. I think make these leaps, like the connections in your book, or Edgar Allan Poe called it ratiocination. And I don't know if you know, he solved Olber's paradox about the fact that the night sky is not completely white with stars because there's a bounded visible universe, and he solved that like 60 years before Hubble or something like that in one of his poems.
It's a lot.
And like Watson Crick, the double helix came to them in a dream, and poetry is the stuff of dreams, and you can make these leaps through poetry. I think we have a lot to learn from each other. So it's really cool to find a poet that's actually embedded with scientists. It's really neat.
Yeah, and one of the things that I found so cool and rewarding is that I think just because I don't have quote unquote a brain for this stuff, you know what I mean? Like science is not a language that I speak fluently. I've had to teach myself like through trial and error. There's still a lot of things that I do not even understand. But I love it, right? I'm fascinated by it. And I'm fascinated by the vocabulary that science bears on a poem, this diction syntax that you would otherwise never get. And I'm really fascinated by like the constraint, these are all free verse poems. I guess one is a sonnet, but it kind of broke. But, like scientific fact was a way for me to impose form on a free verse poem. But I think, the thing is too, is what I got from being around these paleontologists is, I have to phrase this carefully because it makes it sound like they don't know what they're doing. They do, but they're so willing to experiment in a way that, having not been around scientists, I did not anticipate, right? I thought that they were much more certain in what they were going to find. It was much more about proving a hypothesis than it was gathering data. And so it was really rewarding to have these conversations with people, because it was like one of the questions that I actually wrote down, and it makes its way into, I think, the last piece in the book is, one day we're at a conference table and someone just says like, well, in science, the question is always like, what does this mean? And I was like, well, that's not at all different than writing a poem, right? And I've been a fool for all these years thinking that we went about this process totally differently, because of course we did not, right? So we just have different subjects. That's all.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and that's cool to hear too. Well, Kathleen Obama says this discussion about the false binary between art and science is refreshing, and I totally agree.
Good.
Yeah, it really is. I wish, my daughter, for her class, they have some kind of Excel, but they call it STEAM instead of STEM, which I really love. They throw the art in there, which is a good idea. Well, do you want to read 2 more poems maybe, and we'll keep moving along?
Yeah. And I was going to, yeah. Let me see. Okay. I will do one of the poems that, it's right in the middle, and it kind of gets away from the paleontology, although it still works its way in there. It's called Among the Bones. It's on page 20 in the chapbook. Among the Bones. Another year without my father. Another year spent bringing home bones from the wood. On my desk are dead things. A jar of the dog's white fur that the vet shaved to better see the last needle in. A porcupine skull rippled with sutures. Oyster halves. I spilled a glass of wine on the sand dollar, but the next morning, head throbbing, I bleached it back to normal. That first day shadowing the paleontologist, I was afraid to touch the rigid tooth of mammoth. I used 2 fingers, like I would a baby who hasn't set. I'm not going to hurt it, said the paleontologist. She was measuring a tusk. It survived 1,000 years in the ground. Among the bones in that cool room, I felt the weight of something like geology. Drawers and cabinets filled with pieces of dead things. The jumble of bison teeth. Ancient horses so plentiful, no one bothers to catalog them. After the vet left the house, I plucked the puff of fur from the trash, put it in a jar. The advantage to dead things is that you cannot hurt them anymore. Instead, they hurt you, over and over and over. The fur in its jar, the skull of a northern mockingbird, the impossible lightness of grief. And then I'll read, there's a poem at the end that's a lot about that similarity between art and science. So it's called A Story About Bones. It's on page 33. As it turns out, paleontology and poetry are not all that different. Both the excavating of a shard here and there, an attempt to see what fits, the painstaking assembly of meaning from fragments, maybe, if you get lucky, a tooth, pointed, and the people in their practical clothes and boots, sometimes even the same tiny brushes. And at the museum, I kept calling the collections stacks. So instead of poem, let's just say word cage. All morning I've been laboring at this. The way I regard something for hours. Come back, and in the new light over the desk, something shifted. Suddenly I see the tusk, the femur, or the weapon, how it fits in my hand like it's always been there. Like I never put it down.
Those were 2 more poems from the Last Mastodon. If you don't have a copy of The Last Mastodon yet, you can buy it for just $6 at rattle.com.
Yeah,
So pick it up, and that includes shipping. Like, we ship for free. We just want books out in the world. So pick up a copy if you don't have it. It's a great book. One of my favorite chapbooks that we've done. So I hope you enjoy it too. Daniel here says, I'm an ecology major and poet. The hardest part about writing in my research subject is not becoming obscure with jargon, trying to draw out strangeness without alienating readers. So do you have any advice about that? That's an interesting subject.
It's so interesting that Daniel brings that up, because like I said, I think one of the great things that science does to a poem is it introduces this surprising syntax or diction, right? I think that it's important to remember, like anything, if you lose the reader, like the poem's dead in the water, right? And jargon tends to be that specialized vocabulary. And I teach in a university, so academics are really bad about this, right? It's like we use this huge word when like the simpler word will do. But I would say, don't cut all the jargon out of your poems, because that's part of the loveliness. I love a poem that the speaker shows me vocabulary that I would never encounter in my day-to-day life, but contextually I know what they mean, right? Or they're deriving pleasure from the sounds. So on the one hand, it's like, don't alienate your reader with too much jargon, but on the other hand, like, trust your reader to follow you. Like, whatever you're digging in ecology, like someone's going to follow you,
Yeah, and in the age of Wikipedia, you can look anything up. Like, there's a poem in the current issue of Rattle, or maybe the fall issue of Rattle, about scototropism, which
Sure.
I had to look it up. And once I did, it was really interesting, the metaphor that was being used there, which you'll have to go look that up. But scototropism is the way plants grow toward the sunlight. So you can throw in words like that and assume everybody in the world has a smartphone pretty much. Anybody can Google one word, I think. So
yeah, it's like in creative writing workshops, it's always like, take care of your reader. And I'm like, your reader carries a computer in their pocket. Like, they'll be fine. Make the rest of the poem good enough that they want to come back, right? They don't get lost, like, looking up scototropism and then, like, fall down BuzzFeed, right? But, like, quick Google, then they're back. That's how all of us learn vocabulary.
It's true, yeah. And one of the pleasures of poetry is to learn, So it's to expand your map of the world and understand things that you didn't know before. So it's always good to get to learn. And I learned a lot from this book, which is really fun.
And how cool that, like, when you learn it from a poem, you know what I mean? Because we have these really fixed ideas sometimes of what a poem is supposed to do, whatever that means. And so if you're able to come away from reading a book, about plants, and like it's also a book about poetry or a book in verse, like that's a cool book. Mm-hmm. You should write that book. I want to read that book. Daniel, go write this book.
So since you mentioned like what a poem should do, let's start touching that topic. Like, what do you think a poem should do, and why? One of the things, I looked up a couple interviews that you had, and one of the things you say is that you're a poet in a family of engineers.
Yeah.
And so what is a poem, what should a poem do, and how does that apply to why you became a poet?
Yeah, so, I mean, they're not all engineers. They're mostly engineers. It's just an easier soundbite. My dad was a failed engineer, geologist, you know this. I would say that the only thing a poem should really do is just not take itself too seriously. And I don't mean that it can't be a serious poem. I write about serious things all the time. As I said on Twitter, getting ready for this interview, I was like, all my poems are about sad or dead things, right? But I think that when a poem, stops thinking about the reader, then that's the only time a poem really fails for me. When a poem is so self-important that it stopped thinking about me, right? So if a poem starts chasing its tail in a way, or a poem is doing something really clever with language, but it's so proud of itself, these are hard things to articulate. And, but there's a moment, right? There's a moment where you're reading a poem and you feel like there's this distance between you and the poem. And I don't mean the speaker. The speaker can hold you at arm's length. That's a choice the speaker gets to do. But when the poem feels like it's pushing you away, that's usually the only time that I kind of lose interest in the poem. Finishing it becomes more of an exercise in completion than like I want to see where this goes. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's the only thing a poem really should do is it shouldn't take itself so seriously that it totally neglects its readers,
Mm-hmm.
And not every poem's going to be for everyone, right? I mean, it's okay. It's okay if I read the one poem and I'm like, oh, all right, I got to come back to that one. Maybe I didn't encounter that poem at the right time in my life. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But I think so many poems are just like these total acts of generosity, and like that's one of the really great things about reading, right? Is like you see the labor that somebody put in just so they could, like, I don't know, reach across the universe and connect with you. Like that's the coolest, strangest thing I could ever think of.
Yeah, that is acts of generosity. I like that. I never thought of it that way, but that's true. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like letting yourself be vulnerable so you can communicate in a way
Yeah.
that, yeah.
Yeah. Even if that vulnerability manifests as like, here's my really prickly poem that wants nothing to do with you, that's pushing you away, right? But like, I think you can tell the difference between a poem that's doing that intentionally versus one that is just maybe like showing off, right? Or that it's lost sight of itself.
Mm-hmm.
I made the poem very sentient in this conversation. I sound dangerously stupid. But that's the hard thing about writing is that you can say all the pithy things in the world, but like when it's working, you just know it's working, right? Mm-hmm. So
that sort of segues into something else I wanted to ask. There was an interesting quote in one of these things that I just read today. You said you need to practice craft, but you also have to respect the amount of time that process takes. I don't think a writer should be project-driven. I think they should be process-driven. Process takes time. Craft takes time. So could you explain a little bit just what you mean by craft versus process and what you were getting at there? It's an interesting sort of distinction.
Yeah, I'm just big on process. I think it's because I but like I was a total perfectionist as a kid, which is a really great way to just grow up like anxious about everything. But I was, like this sounds conceited. Don't worry, I failed at many things, but I was always the sort of student and person who was like, oh, here's a thing I've never done before. I'm sure I'll be great at it, right? It's like, which, as it turns out, when it comes to things like skateboarding or cutting my own hair, not true. But it took me a long time, I think, as a writer to get really comfortable with just, and I use the word labor a lot, the labor of writing, mm-hmm. Because it was I was just really driven by like how great the thing was going to be at the end, right? And this sounds dangerously cliche because it's basically like, enjoy the journey, right? Like it's all about the journey, not the destination, but like kinda, mm-hmm. right? I mean, the journey is good and the destination is cool, but for me, a lot of becoming comfortable as a writer was becoming really comfortable in the timeline of things. Knowing that like a poem wasn't necessarily going to get finished in like a day or 3 days. Mm-hmm. Some poems do. Some poems kind of come out fully formed because I think that you've actually been thinking about them a lot more than you realize. And then, it's not like the muse visited you. It's just you had already kind of done like a lot of the pre-labor. But a lot of times when you're working on something, it's like if you're project driven, I think there's a real danger that you push through the thing mm-hmm. just to get to the project, right? And as writers, I mean, if we're being totally 100% honest, we know this, we feel this. We feel ourselves working the line too hard, or we put down this really beautiful image, but it's like hollow. It doesn't actually mean anything, right? But it's very pretty. It has a lot of alliteration. And I think that's kind of a tough way to approach writing. And I think you can get away with it for a while, but eventually, you get to the point where you look back at your own work and you feel nothing. And that's a pretty crummy feeling. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's what I think about process. It also just, writing is an exercise in patience. And as an extremely impatient person, it's been really good for me to do that. And also that's why Mastodons are so great, because it like totally changes your timeline. Like, who cares what you're doing? You're in the Holocene era. Do you know how many things happened before you? So, yeah.
Do you have any advice for finding the process and finding patience?
Oh, I mean, I would love to hear it if I do. I think that, so one thing I do actually tell my students all the time is, I always tell them though, like as much as process matters, like don't make it the act of writing so precious that you can't replicate it easily, right? So I mean, it's great if it's like, hey, I need to use this type of pen and I need to have like this type of light and like I have to have this type of decaf green tea. But, I think if you make it too magical like that, then the next time like you don't like the coffee shop is out of tea, right? Then it's like, well, I'll just go home. No. Like you can do this on a plane. You can write a poem on a plane. You know what I mean? So, so I think it's really good to like figure out how you train yourself into a little bit of the ritual because it helps kind of get you going, but never make it so precious that like if one thing goes wrong, you can't do it.
Yeah. Well, I always feel like what we're doing when we're writing is we're Zen meditating without like knowing it, or usually, And so sometimes you need like, if you go to a Zen center, you need like the chair and the person ringing the bell and stuff. But then once you actually learn how to do it, you can do it anywhere. And I kind of feel like that's how writing is, because that's what we're doing, is we're turning off that conscious mind that's sort of injecting itself constantly and letting those connections be made that are surprising, that we're not going to realize were coming before they were. And so it's good to find a way to do that without the crutches that you start with. Once you can throw away the crutch, you're good.
Yeah, you train yourself, right? It's like this superpower that people have. Like I'm really jealous of people who can meditate easily, because I can do it for like 7 sustained minutes, and that's with an app, right? Like an app telling me to do it. But there is something to be said, yeah. Like once you figure out how to train yourself, then you kind of it's a lot easier to get started, right? And that's the same thing. I mean, when you're on a real tear writing and you're clicking away, like you don't want to look at Twitter, right? It's like you're distracting yourself with Twitter in like the first 5 minutes because you're like, I'm writing. No, you're not. You're on Twitter, Christina. I know what you're doing. But then once the stuff starts coming out, it's like I don't care what's happening, right? And then you look up and like a couple hours have passed, and that's a really cool feeling, right? Like, ooh, I like left for a little while.
Yeah.
So, yeah, and everyone's busy, right? I mean, I love that more than one working mother and writer in my life has been like, you know what? I have kids. That totally changes the way I write. I get an hour. Like, I am the most efficient in that hour. I am a beast, because like that's my time, and it's not going to come around again. As opposed to, like me just kind of tra-la-laing through the landscape, and I'm like, I don't know, how do I feel about it? So
yeah. Well, you have you sent a poem that's not from the book. Somebody's grandmother. Do you want to read that just to make sure we get it in?
Still about dead things. This is a poem about a place I used to live in Michigan, and we were on the flight path to a hospital. So it's called Somebody's Grandmother, and it appeared in the Atticus Review, and then it was published in Terminal Human Velocity. Somebody's grandmother handed me a pack of tissues when I broke down in the Atlanta airport after signing a lease on a house we'd never even walked through, one filled with fleas. And somebody's grandmother sat next to me on that long flight home, told me that some things, her sister dying of cancer, were worth crying over. And some were just shitty, and being grown up means being able to tell the two apart. Then she ordered me a ginger ale. And later that day, I tried to pay it back. I sat next to somebody's grandmother on her first flight in 20 years. It is so different now, she kept saying. I took her elbow, showed her where the bags would fall out. And it was somebody's grandmother that sirens wailed for last night, then went silent at the last light before the hospital. I used to stand under the helicopters that cut their way across our corner of Michigan and be glad that somebody was having a worse day than I. But now I know that each medevac was actually a white hummingbird, deeply engaged in the frantic beating back of death. And now I wish I could still see them. Those little birds full of somebody's grandmothers, those races against the inevitability that await us all.
And that was Somebody's Grandmother by Christina Olson. Christina, is that from a book, or where is that from?
Yeah, it's in this book.
Terminal Human Velocity. And I don't have a copy of that book. What's that about? I heard that Shackleton was in there, and that there was somebody who jumped out of the Empire State Building and fell back into the window.
Yeah, so this one came out in 2017. The poems probably go like a couple of years before that, probably as many as 10 years before that. If you read this book, you start to see the science coming into the poems, so there's a poem, for example, about like horseshoe crab blood and how we use a chemical in it to test our modern medicine. And then, as you said, there's two poems about the story of Elvita Adams, who is a woman who attempted to kill herself by jumping off the Empire State Building, but she only fell one story because the building goes out. And so she didn't die at all, and she only broke a hip. So the book is Terminal Human Velocity, which is, the way that you calculate the physics of a body falling, which sounds kind of dark. But I think it's just kind of one of the things about science and poetry is that it gives us, or science in life, is that it gives us a vocabulary. There's like almost like a dispassionate vocabulary that you can apply, a sort of equation. And as someone who spends a lot of time thinking on the emotional side of things, I really kind of had a good time figuring out what I could take from science that didn't feel quite so emotional all the time, right? Because at the end of the day, we are probably just sacks of meat, right? And So a lot of the poems have to do with that. And then Ernest Shackleton, who is my secret boyfriend.
So Shackleton, he tried to find the South Pole, but didn't make it, right? Is that the right story?
Didn't kill anybody. Like every other expedition, they all died, and Shackleton was deeply heroic. The sled dogs died. They had to shoot them for food. And then a carpenter got 3 toes amputated. But that was the greatest loss that they suffered, which for 1917 was pretty good. Yeah. My family, we to circle back a little bit, you would ask, what's it like being a poet in a room full of engineers? My family loved Shackleton. And so that was an early, connection point where we used to sit around Thanksgiving and talk about Shackleton, and then one day I was like, hey, I wrote a couple poems about Shackleton, and everyone was like, really? All right, maybe I'll try these poems you speak of, right?
That's interesting. Yeah. I just watched The Terror did you see that show yet? With it's about that Arctic exploration, not Antarctic.
Oh, but, like the HMS Terror and
Aruba? Yeah.
Oh, that expedition was rough.
I know. Yeah, it imagines what had happened. And it's a really cool show. It's got that British guy who's in everything. He was like Chernobyl and like The Office, and I don't know what his name is, but he was in everything. But it was good. So
these explorations, I don't because to me it's like the worst possible thing you could ever do is get on a ship and try to go find your way through ice. So I read about men doing it. I'm just like, okay.
and we're probably opening up. Our lifetime has been a time where we haven't done that, but we're going to Mars soon, I think. The next 10, 20 years. Elon Musk says he wants to die on Mars. And I think he probably will.
That is also really scary. My personal hell is everyone's like, you're going to Mars. And I'm like, I don't on a rocket for 3 years. I really don't.
Yeah. Mars is terrifying. I mean, the whole, if anything happens, you get the bends immediately. That is not cool. So what do you have next? You don't do projects, but you do process. What's next in the process?
So I am... It's something I think starting to resemble a series of poems about anxiety, my old friend. And they kind of started out as these goofy little poems, and then I find it really fun to write them because it's like this distancing, right? Like a poem asks you to put something into language, and And I think once you put something into language, you've taken a lot of the fear out of it, not all of it. Mm-hmm. Sometimes you create a new fear. Yeah, so I'm working on that. So that will probably be a third collection. And then I'm actually working on a book-length lyric essay about the Coney-style hot dog.
The Coney-style hot dog. What is? I've been to Coney Island once, but what is the Coney-style? I don't know if I had a hot dog or not.
Okay, so this is a little bit like talking about like barbecue or pizza. So like, please, people on YouTube, like, I understand there are regional differences. I've lived in both Ohio and Michigan, but it's a type of hot dog that has a meat sauce on it. The uninitiated would call it chili. It's not really a chili. Like, it's a different type of meat sauce. There's rarely beans in it, but I love using food as a lens to think about regionality, right? Like, I love the way that we declare our allegiance to certain things, totally based through food. And I love the story of the hot dog, which is this like distinctly American thing, right? And yeah, so I think a lot about hot dogs. I try not to eat a lot of hot dogs, but I think about them all the time. So if anyone listening has any place they want me to go eat hot dogs, like, I'll add it to my list. Yeah. But it's actually, like the book is shaping up to be a story about immigration, right? And like I said, kind of American regionalism and the stories we tell through food, and then what it's like to live in really cold parts of the country. And a hot dog is the only thing that makes you happy sometimes.
For the poems on anxiety and sort of the way narrative helps with anxiety, there's a guy who does, I can't remember, I wrote a paper about it, or a little article for the newspaper about it. What is his name? I can't remember. But there's a guy who's actually studied the way that composing your own narrative relieves anxiety. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I don't, but I know that we tell ourselves stories in order to live, right? I mean, like,
yeah, definitely. But he's had trials where he has a whole thing where he has people write the narrative of either their traumatic experience or something like that, and then it works better somehow than both the placebo and both like drugs.
Wow.
What is his name? I can't remember, but maybe I could send it to you. But it's interesting research. I read a whole bunch and wrote like a little short article about it, because I like to write articles about that. Anyway, do you want to finish off with one poem? Is there something else you want to read?
Yeah. This is a little bit of a happy poem. This is a poem. I didn't send it to you, so I'm sorry. But
that's okay.
It's called 3-Month Anniversary, and I wrote it cleverly titled it after I've been married for 3 months. So, 3-Month Anniversary. There's nothing in the etiquette guides for a marriage so short, so I wake early on a Saturday. Bring us home Subway. The egg whites, because I want you to live forever, or at least outlast me. Friends keep asking if it feels different, and they don't like the answer. No, not really. Pretty much the same. But what did they think? Bliss. Such bliss. Seriously, I got fired from my job because I couldn't focus on anything but the sheer bliss. Every sneeze starts as a gasp, and then it settles itself down. And really, there are nice little moments, like the time we picked all the mulberries, our hands murderous with blue juice. Even a bush knows how to be beautiful 3 weeks a year.
Well, thanks so much for sharing that, Christine. That was great. And thanks so much for joining us on the Rattlecast. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I wish we could talk longer. It's a lot of fun. I love what you write about and what your interests are. So it's really fun.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everyone who's read it.
Yeah. Have a great night.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, so that was Christina Olson. And her book, of course, is... oops, hang on a second. Her book is The Last Mastodon, which came out with the winter issue. For anybody who is a subscriber, you, of course, have a copy. And hope you enjoyed it. Now we're going to move on to our open mic portion of the show. Now, we have a prompt every week, which is a lot of fun. And, well, I don't know. Fun is sort of a relative term. I struggled this week. I kind of struggle every week. But if you would like to call in and read your prompt poem or anything else, I should say, let me throw this up on the screen. Our open mic number is 818-850-7727 if you want to call me up. Or you can also call over Skype and do it by video. That is Rattle Poetry, all one word. I'll answer over chat, and then I'll find you and give you a call. Liz Gallo is here. She'd like to call in. Let's see. She says she'd like to call in, but we're doing prompts. But it doesn't matter. So we're doing open mics and we're doing prompts. I want to help myself mostly get back into writing poetry because I haven't written poetry in so long. It's been about 10 years since I've written regularly. Every once in a while I have some kind of retreat or conference or something where I actually write a little bit. And it feels great when I have the time to do it, but I don't do it regularly and it drives me crazy. So that's why we're doing prompts, is just for me. But hopefully if it helps me, it helps you and it helps Megan. And all of that is really good. So let's look up really quick. Now, last week's prompt, let me put this up. I got to juggle all these screens. Last week's prompt was, the stuntman walks home from work. Must reference a Shakespearean work, either within the poem or in an epigraph. And now as has been the case, I keep saying I'm going to write a poem ahead of time, but we went on vacation this weekend, and I have to, every time I go anywhere, I have to set up everything like online and all the social media stuff ahead of time. So it's exhausting getting all the stuff to keep Rattle functioning as if I'm actually here still. And so we went on vacation to San Antonio, which was a lot of fun. We went to a museum, and we went to the Natural Bridge cave where the kids saw some stalactites and stalagmites for the first time. That was really great. But anyway, so I got home last night, and I was too tired to write a poem. So I wrote a poem like a half an hour before we went on air. And it was meant to be a sonnet, but I didn't get that far. So it's a sonnet without the, it's missing 6 lines, but it's an 8-line sonnet. And so I was thinking, let me put this up. Where do I get this? Here he is. This is my poem. And you had to use a Shakespearean line. My goal was to use, the more my prayer, the lesser is my grace, from A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I was going to write about, the struggle to write for the first time. It's like stretching muscles you haven't used in a while. And I was going to use that line, the more my prayer, the lesser is my grace, in the poem itself. He was going to think that or say that like in the next little 6-line section that's missing, but I ran out of time because I was doing this like a half an hour ago. So this is my poem. This is The Stuntman. Walks home from work across the empty page and turns to find his footsteps look like words he'd drawn in mud before he learned to read. A catastrophic limp betrays his age. His broken feet more crooked than a bird's, he shuffles back to cover up the deed, but turns to find another line has strung itself, despite himself, along this song. That was my Stuntman, The Stuntman poem. I'm probably going to work on it and finish it out, because it's missing those 6 lines, but that's what it is. Now, Megan wrote a better poem than me. Is probably every episode we're going to have Megan do a better poem than me, because that's just how it goes. And here's Megan's. This is The Stuntman Walks Home. And also, by the way, she apologizes for using Stuntman, because it's probably Stunt Person or Stunt Woman. There are plenty of Stunt Women these days, but we weren't thinking. This is The Stuntman Walks Home. And her little epigram from... Oops, what did I do? Her little epigram from William Shakespeare, from King Lear. As flies to wanton boys, are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport. That's from King Lear. And her poem was, I've got the soundstage... Oops, hang on a second. I've got the soundstage 23 Stuntman blues, music in my head and blood in my shoes. Down the neon avenue, I'm wireless and wired, a purpled puppet. You think you know tired. Try leaping buildings until ground and air mix up in your mind. What you call a dare is an ordinary Monday to me. I still shake my way through it sometimes, the ache of every mistake I've made in my bones. Rig me up with foam and microphones. Flick me into the arena's stage of dust. Give me your misdirected rage, your bloodlust, and I'll save your hero's pretty face. There's not a joint I can't replace except the one I'm lighting up as I pass through my door, ready to soak my ass in the tub and retire my battle cry beneath the stars that burn and shine and die. So that was Megan's poem. For her own prompt, The Stuntman Walks Home. Now, let's see. We only had one other person send the poem this week. And that other person was Shaun Hines. He sent two, actually, so he's an overachiever. And he said that this having prompts is sparked his, or rekindled his desire to write poems and submit them, which is great. That's the whole point. So thanks so much, Shaun, for saying that. This is bio really quick. Shaun Hines studied English with an emphasis in creative writing at Old Dominion University. An aspiring poet and novelist is he. And here is his poem. This is A Smile Once Given. Let them fight, the crowd had chanted, mirror images nose to nose. The doppelganger teased the star, breaking character to grin, when the star's real-life girlfriend crashed through a glass door, distracted by the stuntman's sneaky side-eyed glance toward her carefully crafted figure jiggle crossing the room. Fired and escorted out by an off-duty cop moonlighting as head of security, drowning his sorrows in a couple pints of ale sounded like a good plan. Finding his tires slashed, he cursed God. He'd have the truck towed home while he walked to the pub 2 blocks over. Cut off hours after his first drunk, the stuntman began to stumble toward home disoriented, tripping over his feet and thoughts. He lifted his head just in time to catch a glimpse of the passing Corvette streak like a shooting star before the brake lights blinded like high beams on the secluded road. Not recognizing the car or the smiling woman watching him through the side view mirror, he pressed on unaware. The happy couple approached as he emptied the contents of his stomach on a drying shrub. She cared too much. Her smile betrayed her. Her pity deceived them all. Jealousy struck her where her brain stem and spinal column meet, breaking her neck. Fear consumed the stuntman. Sweat beaded on his brow. His throat was drier than the Sahara Desert. He couldn't scream. No one would hear him on the No one would hear him on the back road. He closed his eyes and prayed for his killer, lashing out recklessly, assuming guilt from an innocent smile. His brain splattered in every direction. A smile once given can never be reclaimed, the movie star said. No flirtation is innocent. Himself, once back in the car, a copy of Othello stared up at him. At once riddled by guilt, he swore Othello's spirit was in him. Distraught, not knowing what to do, he stole a burial at sea. And that was Shaun Hines' poem from the prompt, A Smile Once Given. Now, I have to hang on one second because I forgot to include the next prompt. So I'll have to read it to you. But in just 1 second, once Word opens up, we'll read you the next prompt. And let's see. Hang on a second. Okay. So the next prompt is going to be the Dinosaur Museum at 3 a.m. must be at least 40 lines long, so you can't cop out and write a short one like I've been doing the last couple of weeks. The Dinosaur Museum at 3 a.m. must be 40 lines long. Lines can be of any length. So I guess you'd have 1 word per line, and that would do it. So imagine the Dinosaur Museum at 3 a.m., and that's Megan's prompt for the week. Now, Liz Gallo is here, and she would like to read a poem. So let me call her up. Just bear with me for 1 second while I give her a call. So Liz Gallo is here. Liz, turn off your... Oops. She hung up on us. Let's try again. Answering again. Liz, hi. Hang on one second. Let me pull you in the feed. So good to see you again, though. Thanks for calling. And I remember you're calling from Toronto, Ontario, I think, if I remember right. Hang on one second because... Let's see. Oh, there you go. Okay. So Liz Gallo, how you doing tonight? Good to see you.
Good. I'm good. I'm great.
And what do you have for tonight? You mentioned, I think, on the chat message that you don't have a prompt poem, but you have a Shakespeare quote. Is that what you were saying?
Yeah, I have a Shakespeare-inspired poem.
There you go. Well, that's halfway there. But I should say, just so everybody knows, you don't have to do the prompt to be on the open mic. You can do whatever you want on the open mic. But if you have a prompt, we're trying to encourage people to write poems, and so that's always good too. So what's your poem tonight, Liz?
So my poem, I do love prompts, so I will try to do a prompt poem. They're super helpful, I think. But this poem is called, I would call it Midsummer Night's Dream fan poetry inspired. It's called Carnival. And yeah, I wrote it this summer, and I was sort of thinking about how it was during Caravana in Toronto, and how times of carnival are sort of liminal spaces, and Midsummer Night's Dream kind of plays on that idea of liminal spaces where things go all topsy-turvy. So yeah, so this is Carnival. On a midsummer's night, I didn't dream. I sat in a corner crying, still I couldn't sleep. All the potions in the world won't make you see the power in me. I want to be queen. While the fairies play in a summer's past, I was Helena at the forest dance. 2 suitors, and I thought they mocked me for laughs. But instead I became Tatiana and in love with a donkey's head. So I stayed in the forest with sprites and shadows, the sliver of moon through the leaves, a place where a man's authority couldn't hurt me. And so I say, give me your hands. When disorder and chaos come to play across borders, seas, and lands, I'll dry my tears and gift you with one last summer's dance.
Ah, very nice. Thanks so much, Liz. That was great. Yeah, thanks for calling in and sharing that.
Nope. Awesome show. Loved it. Loved the Mastodon.
Yeah, me too. Yeah, well, thanks. Have a great night.
You too.
Okay, bye. So that was, let's see, is there anyone else who wants to call in on the open mic? You know, we can still, let me just say the number one more time in case anybody's here who would like to call. The number is 818-850-7727. That's just a regular phone number, so you can call from any phone that you have. It doesn't matter, it doesn't have to be Skype or anything like that. And that's always good to do. If you do have Skype, it's just Rattle Poetry, all one word. Now, I have one pre-recorded poem that I set up. If you give me 1 second, we will play it. And this is by Laura Potts. I think she might have done a poem before. I can't remember, but she lives in... let me just read her bio really quick. Laura Potts is 23 years old and lives in West Yorkshire, England. Twice recipient of the Foyle Young Poets Award. Her work has been published in Aesthetica, The Moth, and Poetry Business. Having worked at the Dylan Thomas Birthplace in Swansea, Laura was nominated for the Pushcart Prize and became one of the BBC's New Voices last year. And her first BBC radio drama aired at Christmas, so that's really cool. Hang on 1 second as I set this poem up. Now, if the broadcast was choppy a little bit today, we ordered a new computer. So that will be a thing of the past. I know it was freezing a little bit for me. I'm bringing up this poem right now, which is by Laura Potts. Let me turn this on so you can hear it. That's always good. And here is Laura Potts' poem. This is, once again, The Bramblelands by Laura Potts.
This is Laura Potts from West Yorkshire in England. The Bramblelands. 20 years from where we were, I stand by the garden gate, watching the younger me swinging free feet over the wall. Small, and as young as the summer will always be, with you and your dungarees, soil-stained and torn, as you swallow the last of the corner shop sweets, and the sun rolls back on his thread. He licks the lawn into colour, and we laugh, talking over how the shadows will fold into the sooner dawn, and how a piece of old moon will unwind on her spool, saying, "This is the way it is meant to be. This is the way we were born." Today we have been wildlings and escaped to some place in the forest where the trees play the light through their leaves. Their arrows cling to your skin until your hair is a chorus of gold, until you look at me with those eyes which say, "Will we come back here when we are old? Oh, when we are old." With cracked hands, we churn up a wheelbarrow out of the shed and freewheel down to the stream. I flip a pebble and watch it drown, while you say, "Like this," and cartwheel another. It skitters and lives, gifted, as a blackbird trills above, calling, "One day you will laugh, and one day find love." Then the silver thread chimes from the back door, a woman's soft voice and the scent of knives and forks. We part through the fence, our secret handshake. Tomorrow we will meet on our wall and be young again. Now, I watch from the gate as our voices spill into our kitchens, and wonder whether you, like me, will ever stand in the sad glamour of rain, your eyes bright before the lights of childhood again.
And that was Laura Potts on the totally open mic reading
This is Laura
The
Potts
Bramble
from
Lands. Oops, let me not. Yeah, that was Laura Potts reading The Bramble Lands from the open mic. Laura submitted that through Submittable, and I think I'm going to turn that back on, but you can either use, I think from now on, you'll just, whichever is easier, you can use Submittable and find the Rattlecast open mic link there. Also, you could just email openmic@rattle.com, and you can do it that way. That's whether or not you are sending a prompt poem or just an open mic poem that you'd like to share with everybody on the Rattlecast. It's just a lot of fun to share poems and celebrate publication and all that stuff. So I hope you do that. Now that's all for the Rattlecast for today. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please do click the like button and share and all that good stuff. No matter where you're watching this, sharing and liking and giving it 4 stars, all that stuff really helps, because that's the way things work in the digital universe. You have to click on stuff to tell the computer overlords what you actually like, because they use that to determine what other people might like. And so if you click the like button, that really helps a lot. If you share and see first and turn on notifications or whatever the heck, whatever platform you're watching this on, if you do that, that really helps. So please do that. Once again, Rattle is a publication of the Rattle Foundation, a 501c3 nonprofit working to promote the practice of poetry. We've been in continuous publication since 1995, and we're just here for the love of poetry. So do help us out by sharing stuff. Now, next week, we are going to have Susan Brown and her book, Just Living. Susan Brown is in the current issue of Rattle, number 66. She's also in issue number 67 as one of Kim Adenizio's students. Issue number 67 is at the printer right now, and if you're a subscriber, you'll be getting that in just a few weeks. Susan Brown's a great poet. We've published her 3 times now, and it's always really good poems, so I'm looking forward to meeting her. I assume she's in the Bay Area since she's one of Kim Adenichio's students. And yeah, hope to see you then. And in the meantime, have a great week. Good night.